I remember the exact moment my whole life changed. I was standing in the kitchen, 19 years old, holding a birthday cake I'd baked for my dad. And he really looked at me and said, "You know, you don't look anything like me, you never have." He didn't say it gently, he said it like an accusation. I set the cake down on the counter and tried to laugh it off, the way I always did. "Dad, come on, it's your birthday." But he just shook his head, walked out of the kitchen, and left me standing there with candles that hadn't even been lit yet. That was the moment I realized the question he'd been asking for 17 years wasn't going away. It was only getting louder. "My name is Hannah Clark. I'm 24 years old, and I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. I have brown eyes, dark hair, and skin that tans easily in summer. My dad, Robert Clark, has blue eyes and light hair. My mom, Diane, is blonde with fair skin." Growing up, people would sometimes ask me if I was adopted. I always said no, because that's what I believed. That's what my parents told me. But my dad, he never let it go. For as long as I can remember, there was a tension in our house that I couldn't name when I was little. I just knew that sometimes my dad would look at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. He'd get quiet at family dinners when someone mentioned how different I looked from my parents. He'd make small comments, "You must have gotten that from some distant relative," or "Funny how genetics work sometimes." I didn't understand what he was really saying. Not until I was older. When I was about 12, I overheard my parents fighting in their bedroom. I was walking down the hallway to get a glass of water, and their voices were raised, so I stopped. I heard my dad say, "She doesn't look like us, Diane. She has never looked like us." And I heard my mom crying saying, "Robert, please, stop doing this. She is our daughter." I stood there in the dark hallway, barefoot on the carpet, holding my breath. That was the first time I truly understood what my dad had been implying all those years. He thought my mom had been unfaithful, and he thought I was the proof. I went back to my room that night without getting water and lay in bed staring at the ceiling for what felt like hours. I was 12 years old and I had just learned that my own father didn't fully believe I was his child. I didn't cry. I think I was too shocked to cry. I just felt this hollow, heavy feeling in my chest, like something had been removed from the center of me. Things didn't get better after that. If anything, they got more complicated. My dad wasn't a cruel man, I want to make that clear. He was not abusive or violent. He worked hard, he paid the bills, he came to my school events. But there was always this invisible wall between us. He'd hug my older brother Daniel, easily and naturally. With me, the hugs always felt stiff, obligatory, like he was doing something he felt he was supposed to do rather than something he wanted to do. Daniel is 4 years older than me, and he has blue eyes and my dad's exact nose. Nobody ever questioned Daniel. Nobody ever looked at Daniel and did the math. It was only ever me. My mom tried. She really did. She was warm and loving, and she made sure I never felt unwanted, at least not from her side. But I could see it wearing on her too. The years of being accused of something she swore she never did. There were stretches where my parents barely spoke to each other, stretches where the dinner table felt like a courtroom, and nobody wanted to say the wrong thing. I asked my mom about it directly when I was 15. I sat across from her at the kitchen table while she was folding laundry and I just said it plainly. "Mom, does Dad think you cheated on him? Does he think I'm not his daughter?" She stopped folding. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said very quietly, "Your father has some doubts that I have never been able to get rid of, no matter how many times I've told him the truth." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "But you are my daughter. I carried you, I gave birth to you, that I know for certain." That last part, "that I know for certain," stayed with me. I turned it over in my mind for years. At the time I thought it was just an emotional, emphatic way of saying she was sure. Later, I would understand that it meant something much more specific than I realized. I moved out when I turned 18, right after high school graduation. I got a small apartment near Columbus State where I was studying nursing, and I worked part-time at a coffee shop to cover my expenses. Living away from home was like finally being able to breathe. I didn't realize how much tension I'd been carrying in my body until I was out of that house, and the tension started to leave. I still visited on holidays and birthdays. My relationship with my mom stayed close. My relationship with my dad was what it had always been: polite, careful, and sad. He'd ask about school. I'd tell him it was going well. He'd nod and look out the window. There was never a moment of real warmth between us. I had accepted that. I'd told myself that was just how it was going to be. But then came the birthday dinner when I was 19. The cake. The "you don't look anything like me." After that night, something shifted inside me. I was done carrying this quietly. I was done pretending the cloud over our family wasn't real. If my dad wanted to know the truth, then fine. We could find out the truth. I wasn't afraid of it. I had nothing to hide, and neither did my mom. I brought it up with her the following week. I told her I wanted to do a DNA test. Not to prove anything dramatic, just to put the question to rest once and for all. I was a nursing student. I understood genetics. I understood how these tests worked. I thought if we got the results back showing that I was Robert Clark's biological daughter, maybe he would finally let it go. Maybe we could finally have something that resembled a normal family. My mom's reaction surprised me. She didn't say yes right away. She got this strange look on her face, not guilty, exactly, but troubled, worried, like she was afraid of something. I asked her what was wrong and she said, "Hannah, I'm not worried about what the test will say about me. I'm worried about what it might say about something else." I didn't know what she meant by that. I told her I still wanted to do it. She eventually agreed. I ordered a home DNA kit, and we both submitted our samples along with my dad, who agreed to participate, I think because he genuinely believed the results would confirm what he'd suspected for 17 years, and he wanted to finally be proven right. We submitted the samples, and then we waited. I remember the day I got the email saying the results were ready. It was a Tuesday morning. I was at my apartment still in my pajamas drinking coffee. I sat down at my laptop and opened the portal and read through the results carefully, the way I'd been trained to read medical information, looking for the specific data, not jumping to conclusions. I had to read it twice. The results showed that Robert Clark was not my biological father. That part wasn't a shock. Honestly, as painful as it was to see it written there in clinical language, some part of me had been braced for that possibility. But then I scrolled down further. The test showed that Diane Clark was also not my biological mother. I sat very still for a long time. I could hear the coffee maker finishing its cycle in the kitchen. I could hear a car passing outside. I read the results a third time, then a fourth. The words didn't change. I was not biologically related to either of the people who had raised me. The first thing I felt was a strange, floating kind of numbness, like the floor had dissolved beneath me but I hadn't fallen yet. Then I called my mom. She answered on the second ring and I said, "Mom." The results came back. Silence on her end. Then she said, "What do they say?" I told her. I said, "I'm not Dad's. But Mom, I'm not yours either." There was a long pause. And then I heard something I had never heard from my mother before in my entire life. She started to cry in this raw, broken way that didn't sound like her at all. And through the crying she said, "Oh God, oh Hannah, I was so afraid of this." I drove to my parents' house that afternoon. My dad was home, which I hadn't expected. My mom had apparently called him. I walked in and found them both sitting at the kitchen table, which was strange because they hadn't sat at that table together voluntarily in what felt like years. My dad looked pale. My mom's eyes were red. I sat down and said, "Someone needs to tell me what's happening." My mom was the one who spoke. She told me that when I was born, she and my dad had gone through a period of severe financial difficulty. She had been hospitalized during the last weeks of her pregnancy with a serious infection, and the delivery had been complicated and overwhelming. The hospital was busy. It was a large general hospital in Columbus. She said that in the chaos of those first hours after the delivery, there had been some confusion. She'd been barely conscious. My dad had been pulled in multiple directions. She said that when they finally had me, when they were finally holding me and breathing and okay, it didn't occur to anyone to question whether the right baby had been placed in the right arms. She had never questioned it. Not for a single moment. Not because she was careless, but because I was handed to her and she looked at me and she loved me, and that was that. But my dad had questioned it. For 17 years he had questioned it. He just hadn't questioned it in the right direction. He'd looked at me and thought his wife had been unfaithful, never once considering that maybe the hospital had simply made a mistake. The hospital where I was born was called Riverside Methodist Hospital in Columbus. I knew the name. I'd driven past it 100 times. Now the question that was sitting in the middle of all of us, filling up the entire kitchen, was this. If I wasn't Robert and Diane Clark's biological daughter, then whose was I? And somewhere out there, was there another family wondering the same thing? My mom found the paperwork from the hospital, birth records, discharge summaries, everything she'd kept in a manila folder in the filing cabinet for 24 years. I sat with her at the kitchen table, and we went through it together. She had the date, the room number, the doctor's name. It was real. It was documented. It was something to hold on to. I looked into the process for investigating a potential hospital mix-up. As a nursing student, I had some understanding of how these situations work. I reached out to a patient advocacy organization first, just to understand my options. They told me I had rights. They told me this was more common than most people realize, not common in absolute terms, but not unheard of, and that hospitals have records, and that if there had been another baby born in close proximity to me on the same day, there might be another family out there who deserved to know what we knew. My dad, to his credit, didn't disappear after the results came back. He sat with my mom and me through those early conversations. I could see the guilt working through him, not just the guilt of being wrong about my mom, but the heavier guilt of what those 17 years had cost all of us. He didn't say much, but he didn't leave. At one point, when my mom had stepped out of the room, he looked at me from across the table and said, very quietly, "I am so sorry, Hannah." It was the most emotionally direct thing he had ever said to me in my entire life. I didn't know what to do with it in that moment. I just nodded. I said, "I know, Dad." And I meant it. I want to be honest about how those weeks felt. People might expect me to say I felt free, or that everything suddenly made sense, or that I was excited to find out who I really was. The truth is more complicated than that. I felt grief. Deep, aching grief for the family I thought I'd had. For the childhood where I'd never fully belonged. Not because my parents didn't love me, my mom absolutely loved me, but because a question mark had hung over everything, and now I understood why. I also felt something like defiant determination. I had spent my whole life being the person in our family who didn't fit, who looked different, who made my dad uncomfortable just by existing. I was done being defined by that. I wanted answers. I wanted the full picture. It took about 2 months of persistent communication with the hospital, letters, calls, meetings before we got anywhere real. I had a patient advocate with me for most of those conversations. The hospital was understandably careful and legal about everything, and I understood that. I wasn't angry at them, at least not in the beginning. I just kept showing up and asking questions. Then one day, I got a call asking me to come in for a meeting. They said they wanted to speak with me and my family in person. I drove to Riverside Methodist on a Wednesday morning in October. The sky was gray and the leaves were just starting to turn. I sat in a conference room with my mom and the hospital's patient relations director, a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Brennan, and a woman I didn't recognize, a nurse, older, probably in her late 60s, who had been tracked down specifically for this meeting. Mrs. Brennan explained that after reviewing the records from the night of my birth, they had identified something significant. There had been a shift change during a critical window. 2 baby girls had been born within 30 minutes of each other in adjacent delivery rooms. Both were healthy. Both had been cleaned and swaddled and briefly placed in the newborn area together. During the transition between nurses and a brief equipment alarm that had caused some movement in the ward, there was a documented moment of confusion recorded in the log, never followed up on properly. I held very still through all of this. Mrs. Brennan said they believed the mix-up had occurred in that window. The older nurse, her name was Patricia, had been one of the nurses on duty that night. She had retired years ago. She sat across from me with her hands folded on the table, and she looked at me with this expression I'll never forget. It wasn't guilt exactly, it was grief. Long-held, private grief. She said, "I have thought about that night many times over the years. There was a moment that felt wrong, and I told myself I was just tired. I should have said something. I am so sorry." My mom started crying again. Not the desperate, scared crying from the phone call weeks earlier. Something quieter, something more like release. I asked the question I needed to ask. "Is there another family?" Mrs. Brennan said yes, they had located another family. A family in Columbus who had also been reached out to for a confidential conversation. A family whose daughter, a young woman exactly my age, had also, apparently, spent her whole life not quite understanding why she looked so different from her parents. I don't want to share too much about the other family out of respect for their privacy, but I will tell you this. Her name was Lily. She was 24. Same as me. She lived about 20 minutes away. She had been trying, in her own quiet way, to understand her origins for years. We met for the first time at a coffee shop in Columbus, neutral ground. Just the two of us, no parents, no advocates, just 2 young women sitting across from each other, knowing what no amount of words could fully prepare you for. She had blue eyes, she had light hair, she looked exactly like my parents. I'm not going to try to put that moment into pretty words because I don't think pretty words fit it. We sat there and we looked at each other and we both cried. Not dramatically. Just quietly, the way you cry when something too big and too strange and too real happens all at once. We talked for almost 3 hours. We found out that her family had also always felt a low, unnamed tension, not accusatory the way mine was, but a quiet sense of something slightly off. Her parents had never voiced it the way my dad had. They had loved her completely and absolutely, but she had wondered. Over the following months, we were both connected with our biological families through a process facilitated by the hospital and independent genetic counselors. My biological parents were from Columbus. They had never moved. My biological mother cried when she saw me, and I could see myself in her face in a way I had never seen myself in anyone's face before. It was one of the most disorienting and beautiful experiences of my life. But here is what I want to say about my parents, Robert and Diane Clark. They are my parents. They raised me. My mom sang to me when I was sick, and drove me to school for 12 years, and helped me study for my nursing boards over the phone at midnight. And even my dad, with all his doubts, all his misplaced pain, he was there. He went to every single school event. He built the bookshelf that's still in my childhood bedroom. He worried about me when I drove home late at night. Whatever doubt lived inside him, it never completely overrode his sense of responsibility toward me. After everything came out, after all the meetings and the tears and the conversations that lasted until 2 in the morning, my dad asked if he could take me to dinner. Just the two of us. We went to this Italian place in our neighborhood that we used to go to when I was little, before things got complicated. We sat down and ordered, and then he looked at me and said, "I wasted so much time being suspicious instead of just being your father. I will regret that for the rest of my life." He was not a man who cried easily, but his eyes were wet. I reached across the table and I said, "Dad, you're still my dad. You always will be." And I meant it not as a consolation, not as something I was forcing myself to say. I meant it because it was true. Biology is one kind of truth, but the people who show up for you, year after year, even imperfectly, they're a different kind of truth. And I wasn't willing to throw away 24 years just because a lab result told me to. Things with my dad changed after that dinner. Not overnight, and not perfectly. But that wall, that invisible, freezing wall that had been between us since before I could name it, it started to come down. He stopped looking at me like a puzzle. He started looking at me like his daughter. My mom, for her part, was finally free of something she had been carrying for nearly a quarter century. The wrongful accusation, the endless doubt, the years of trying to prove something that had never needed proving, all of it lifted. I watched her become lighter in the months after everything came out. She laughed more easily. She stood up straighter. I am still in nursing school. I am still in Columbus. I have relationships now with both my biological family and my adoptive family, and I am navigating that the way you navigate anything new and complicated, slowly, carefully, with a lot of grace when I can manage it. Lily and I text regularly. We are not exactly sisters, not exactly strangers. We are something the English language doesn't quite have a word for yet. The hospital settled with both families privately. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but I will say that what mattered most to me was never money. What mattered most was the truth. What mattered most was being able to look back at my childhood and understand it, understand why I felt what I felt, why things were the way they were, and to take that understanding forward, instead of carrying the confusion. For a long time, I was the girl who didn't belong. Too dark hair for my family, too different. The one my father looked at and felt doubt instead of joy. That was a painful thing to live with, even when I didn't fully understand what was behind it. But I am not that girl anymore. I am a woman who knows exactly who she is. I know where I came from biologically. I know who raised me and why that matters. I know that love is complicated and imperfect, and that families are made of both blood and choice, and that sometimes life is so strange and so painful that it forces you to hold two things at once: grief and gratitude, loss and discovery. If there is one thing I want someone to take from this story, it is this: the truth is always worth knowing, even when it hurts, even when it breaks something open. Because what comes after the breaking, the understanding, the healing, the possibility of something real, is worth every hard conversation you have to get there. I picked up that birthday cake after my dad walked out of the kitchen that night. I lit the candles alone. I sang to myself quietly because I figured someone should, and I made a wish. I think it finally came true.